Good morning, everyone. Today is Easter, of course, and I was kind of trying to think of a way that this talk might be related to Easter, and was struggling a little bit. And I guess I thought of a few things. So I'm going to talk today about my experience at the senmon sodo, the training monastery in Japan, where I was for about 3.5 months over this past winter. And I guess you could say that, of course, Easter is about the resurrection of Jesus and sort of this broader theme of kind of rebirth and renewal and spring and all of that. And so after leaving the the training monastery, I sort of feel like that a little bit, coming back to spring and kind of feeling alive again. We'll get into that. I'll give you details. So, and I think another thing too is, so I was practicing in Nagasaki. So Nagasaki is sort of like almost the westernmost city in Japan, other than Okinawa. And of course, for Americans, we immediately think of the atomic bombing when we hear Nagasaki. But in Japan, it's a historically very important city. It was kind of more or less founded by Christian missionaries. And it was sort of the main port that Japan sort of interacted with the rest of the world, both Europeans and Chinese and elsewhere. So there's a lot of interesting history there, and not least with Christianity. So those are my best attempts at Easter connections. So the kind of, I wanted to start with a couple of Soto Zen mottos that I heard mentioned several times while I was at the temple, but had never heard here. And I think that that's probably for good reason. One is related to something that we've talked about, so that is dignified conduct is the Buddha Dharma. So we've talked here about Dogen's fascicle Gyobutsu Igi, which kind of touches on this theme. But it wasn't sort of phrased quite like this. I mean, the idea here being is like the way that you carry yourself is kind of an expression of the Buddha Dharma. And here that's not really emphasized so much. Our focus is on Zazen, which of course does have elements of kind of comportment associated with it, but I feel like most people here, once they get off the cushion, they're not really concerned with exactly like what their posture looks like, and I think that's probably fine. And then the other one is maybe a little even more direct, and that is ritual etiquette is our sect's teaching. So this is Saho Kore Shushi. It's a little hard to translate because the first two characters mean something like, I mean, it could be like making the Dharma, but it's more like making the method in this case. And shushi, like the shu can mean sect, but it can also mean something like truth, so it can be like true teaching. So it's a sort of, I don't know, multivariate kind of phrase. But at any rate, both of these get at the importance in Soto Zen in Japan of basically your conduct, the way you carry yourself, being really important. And that was new for me. So I think here, in the US, we might say something like Zazen is the Buddha Dharma, or Shikantaza is our sex teaching, not ritual etiquette. And another, so this is one of the themes that I'll kind of try to be coming back to, is like some of the differences between the way that we practice Soto Zen here versus in Japan. Because of course most of us won't have the opportunity or desire to go practice in Japan. So the idea here is just to give you a little taste of what it was like and sort of my opinion on are we doing the right thing here? Are they doing the right thing there? Or is it somewhere in between? Another sort of theme, I guess, is for me, when I became a priest, there was, a period several years long and sometimes even ongoing where, I kind of wondered what it meant to be a priest. What am I exactly doing that's different from what I was doing as a layperson? But I think that in Japan, there's not really that kind of problem for people because basically they know their role. They're ritual experts at doing Soto Zen ceremonies, particularly funerals and funeral services. For the most part, I mean, that's, the vast majority of people in the Soto Zen school. And I feel like, even me going there, like, I feel like there was an element of professional development. And I feel like a little more like kind of, I understand my profession, so to speak. But I'll come back to that as well. So yet another thing too, the Eihei Shingi, this is a text that we often refer to here. It's a collection of works by Dogen that were compiled after his life, as far as we know. And we tend to focus on Tenzo Kyokun and what's the name of the one at the end that has all the stories about the different people and their roles? Chiji Shingi, yeah, Chiji Shingi. So those are kind of our two favorite, I think, texts from that broader collection. But in Japan, there's, at least at the particular senmon sodo where I was practicing, kind of, you could say, almost an obsession with the chapters that describe like how to do things that we kind of ignore. So like the Bendoho and the Fushuku Sampo, the one about taking meals. And yet at the same time, there's some kind of contradictions there because, they'll be very proud of doing one thing exactly as Dogen described it, but then another thing they'll completely ignore what Dogen said, even though it's the next paragraph of the same text. But in the introduction to that text, Dogen writes, "Standing out has no benefit. Being different from others is not our conduct." And I think that this is not a phrase that most Americans would probably like very much. We like being, I think, different and unique. But the experience at the training monastery is very much where you're trying your best to kind of be like everyone else and not stand out. And if you do, you will be told that you are standing out and that you should not be doing that. There's, a famous phrase, both in Japan and the Amish community, interestingly, that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, and that's definitely true at the training monastery. So let's see. So yeah, I'd say that these kind of themes that I've touched on, so this overarching emphasis on performing ceremonies like in a sort of pretty flawless way, and then also just kind of blending into the overall program, were kind of the hallmarks of practice at a Soto Zen senmon sodo. We did a few ceremonies, like I think there was one at the beginning of the Ango, so that was November 15th. We did one at the first of the new year, and then one at the closing of Ango, where it was sort of similar to what we do here for our shuso ceremony, where everyone asks the shuso a question, and the question has to answer. We did the same thing, but it was directed at the abbot of the temple, which I thought was kind of interesting. I think maybe we should do that here, don't you think? It was, so this was I had been there 2 weeks, when we had this for the first time, and my question was sort of like, what is the meaning of ceremony? And he basically gave this answer, ritual etiquette is our sect's teaching, and that your ability to perform these ceremonies is kind of a reflection of the quality of your practice. And me kind of, I don't know, being a smart ass, I'm like thinking in my head, well, you could probably get a lot of skilled actors to do these ceremonies perfectly that have no interest in Buddhism, and maybe they're the best Buddhists then. And it sort of also reminded me of, Uchiyama Roshi's story about the student coming to him and, in this sesshin during, beautiful weather in April or whatever, when, it was just very comfortable and easy. And he said, oh, I had no thoughts coming up. Was that awakening? And Uchiyama Roshi said, that if that's the case, then awakening is dependent on the temperature and humidity, because if it was, August, you probably wouldn't be feeling that way. And this sort of, to me, seems similar to ceremonies. It's like some people have a natural ability to kind of do these kind of things well, I think. Sort of the same, maybe people that are good at acting or moving their body in a skilled way. So if that's your sort of yardstick for the quality of someone's practice, it's already going to be kind of slanted towards people that have a natural gift, which I don't think is what our practice is about, because, really it's about something universal. So I think if we use only that yardstick, we're kind of missing something. At least that's my feeling. Before I left, I asked Todo-san for some advice, and he said, just follow the schedule. And you don't actually really have a choice. So, I mean, I guess you could, but you'd be really causing problems if you're just like skipping things from the schedule. But, thinking about it some more, and after being there for a while, there's certain things on the schedule that you kind of like. So we had tea every morning, we had gyocha, and Kotaiji, the temple where I was, had a huge number of Danka supporters. So these are families that kind of have like a subscription basically to the temple to do all of the family's kind of death-related ceremonies. And every time that they would come for a memorial service or, whatever, they would bring offerings, so usually fruit and some kind of sweets, sometimes alcohol. And so all of these things would come to the priests. And usually it was at this morning tea when we would eat all the fruits and snacks. And so going to gyocha was always fun, because it was like a half an hour of, stuffing yourselves with, very high quality, cakes and stuff. But then there were other things on the schedule that, I didn't like so much. Sorry, Hoko Baika, I didn't like going to Baika. We also had calligraphy, which, being hardly able to write Japanese, it was very difficult to sort of get your bearings in the calligraphy class. Plus the teacher didn't really seem to teach. He just kind of sat there on his phone, talking with people and stuff. So there were a few things on the schedule that I didn't like. So I took Todo-san's advice to be something like, don't complain about Baika and yearn for the tea. Just kind of try to go along with it with an even keel. And so speaking of the schedule, I thought I would just kind of read through the schedule and explain the different things that we did. Because again, it's very different from here. And a lot of these things I had never heard of before going there. So I thought it might be of interest. So every morning during the regular schedule, we would wake up at 3:55. I thought I'd start by reading the way that this is described in Bendoho by Dogen, the way that you're supposed to wake up in the morning. It's kind of long. I won't read the whole thing, but so toward the end of the night, hearing the sound of the han in the front of the head monk's office, the assembly gets up gently, not rising precipitously. Do not still remain sleeping or lying down, which is rude to the assembly. Quietly take your pillow and place it in front of the cabinet, not making noise as you fold it. Be careful not to disturb the people on the neighboring tans. So the people in this would be a tan, like one tan would be one tatami mat. Stay at your seat for a while, cover yourself with your quilt, and do zazen on your zafu. Strictly avoid shutting your eyes, which will bring forth drowsiness. If you repeatedly open up or flutter your eyes, a faint breeze will enter them, and you will easily be aroused from your sluggishness. Good tip there, by the way. Doesn't really work that well. Never forget that passing away occurs swiftly, and you have not yet clarified the conduct of the way. Do not distract the assembly by stretching, yawning, sighing, or fanning yourself. In general, always arouse respect for the assembly. Never disdain or ridicule the great assembly. Do not cover your head with your quilt. As you become aware of sleepiness, remove the quilt, and with a buoyant body, do zazen. So it sort of goes on this way. It says after a certain point, you should sort of find a time to go over to the sink to wash your face and brush your teeth. And then, you come back and you still have your like bedding out. And then basically when the stuff preceding the morning robe verse, like we do here, when that starts, then you put away your quilt finally. So that's the way that Dogen described it. What we actually did was very different. So basically, you're in the sodo, so you're in this huge room sleeping with like 20 other men, who are all snoring loudly. And sort of the light suddenly comes on. And then you hear this huge drum, going off like right next to your head. And so do not rise precipitously is definitely not what happens. You jump out of bed immediately, and then very quickly sort of like, shove your bedding into this cabinet in front of you. And then you have to turn around really quickly, and then you say this verse of waking up. So you have to get everything away and like be in place before that happens, which is at the end of this series of drums and bells. And then after that, you go and quickly wash your face. So this is another ritual that's described in this text. You're supposed to have hot water. We didn't have hot water. We only had cold water, which is unfortunate. You brush your teeth, and you do all this with this special towel, too, that you use to tie up your robe. So it's this like, it's kind of like a, I don't know, like a washcloth width kind of towel, but it's like 10 feet long. And you kind of wrap it around your sleeves and tie up your sleeves, and you sort of like tuck it into your collars so that you don't get water, because you're wearing your koromo while you do all this. And so you do this quickly. If you have time, you can maybe go to the bathroom, and then you are coming right back to where you were sleeping, which is also where you do zazen. And you start the first period of zazen. It's similar to here, so someone will come in and do their rounds and so forth. So after that, after the doshi comes in and offers incense, you have the first period of zazen, and then there's kinhin. So the kinhin done there is a little bit different than the way that we do it, and it's similar to the karigiri roshi style. So you sort of remain standing for a few minutes, and then bell and the inkin is hit, and then you start doing kinhin. And then the next period of zazen begins. And again, the same drum that woke you up goes off again. It's like a timekeeping drum, so they hit it a certain number of times to sort of tell you what time it is. And then the bonsho, so the really big bell outside, gets rung at this time. So you have this final period of zazen, and there's so much stuff that happens at the end of the second period of zazen, and so many different people required to do it that there's hardly anyone left like doing zazen because everyone has to go outside to like hit various bells or boards or prepare various things in the hall where you're going to be doing the main service. But basically, the time drum goes off again, and then there's someone that hits the umpan, which is like a metal board over in the kitchen, and there's someone that's responding on a wooden board in the sodo, and then they're kind of like going back and forth for a while, and then the period ends with the sort of regular bell in the sodo, and then you do the robe verse, put on the robe, and then everyone kind of gets up and goes over to the main hall to do the morning service. So at Sanshinji, and you kind of get a better sense of this once you've been to sort of like a temple with a normal layout, but this is kind of our Buddha hall over here. So this is our main image, it's Shakyamuni Buddha, and this is kind of our sodo or zendo this way with Manjushri. So in a like typical temple, these would be totally separate buildings. And so you'd get up from here and you'd walk, we had to go outside and then into the Buddha hall to do the morning service. So if you've done the morning service here, it's very simple. We do the Heart Sutra and we do the Daihishindrani and we do one echo after each of those. And basically the doshi does everything themselves. You know, they don't really have anyone taking care of them for the most part. But in Japan, it's very elaborate. So there is a jisha, and you don't have to give the incense just once. You have to give the incense like 5 or 6 times because not only is there the main altar, but there are a number of other altars like behind the main altar. So during the morning service, the doshi is getting up and going all over the place, and the jisha is having to run after them, you know, with the incense. And then in addition, there's a jiko, so someone who carries the incense box, you know, basically doing the same stuff. All the roles are sort of separated. So there's one person playing the mokugyo, and it's huge, and you have to use like 2 hands, and it's much harder to like keep the rhythm properly. And there's a doan who's basically their role is just to hit the kind of bell bowl, but again, it's like, you know, it's like this big, and you need 2 hands, and you have to really like wind up and whack it. And then you have one person who's the kokyo, the person who's like doing the chanting and reading the echoes. And then there's even a person who like will bring out the book with the echoes, you know, and they'll do this funny like dance on the way out. And so it's all very complicated, and a lot of extra sutra chanting that we are unfamiliar with here. So this is my book. So when I entered the temple, they put you in a small room. It's called tangario. They gave us a task though. We got to assemble our sutra books, which was kind of nice. It was like a distraction. So this is all like in, you know, Romaji. So it's like transliterated into letters that we can read. And so in the morning service, we would start with reading a chapter from the Lotus Sutra, which is quite long, you can see. So this is the Fumon Bonge, the Universal Gateway chapter. And then we would do the Heart Sutra, just like we do here. And then depending on the day, you would either do the Sandokai or the Hokkyo Zammai, which are 2 like sort of famous Zen texts. And then you would, you know, read the full lineage. So all of the people, in this case, like in the temple's lineage, going all the way back to the Buddha. And then you do the Daihishin Dharani. And then you'd read all the past abbots of the temple, which, you know, fortunately, Kotaji wasn't that old. It was only like from the 1600s. Some temples that are like 1,000 years old, this can be a very long list. And then you do another chapter of the Lotus Sutra, and then you're done. And all of these have echoes in between them. So this is, the morning service starts at 5:40, so it's still only 5:40 in the morning, and you've done all this stuff. So then after the morning service, there is what they call Chosan no Hai, which is like morning greetings. And everyone sort of says good morning and bows together. And this is where if you made a mistake during the ceremony, you have to say, Sanje yoroshu, like, you know, I messed up. And you know, you have to do it in front of everyone. The abbot will talk about something. So Saito Roshi would sometimes go on these long tangents about, you know, ritual practice and how, like, you know, we're not doing things exactly as is written in the Eihei Shingi, and maybe we should, but we're not going to for now, and these sorts of things. And sometimes you would, you know, be very proud of, we do it the correct way. Not even at Eiheiji do they do it correctly. And sometimes it's about something like very minor, like the distance of the front of your cushion from the edge of the platform in the sodo while you're eating meals. You know, he's like, oh, we're the only ones that do this right. So very fine details. And fortunately, there was someone who spoke English there who could, you know, translate kind of the gist, at least, of these morning kind of talks by the abbot. So then all the sort of higher up people would leave. Reiho-san, who's the English-speaking person, would stay behind and kind of tell us what the abbot said, and then he would also listen to everyone's confessions of the things that they had failed to do correctly. and then, give his, opinion. He was very kind, so he was never harsh. He would just be like, yes, please work on that. And it was also, though, an opportunity for the other people in the training monks, so the group that I fell into, to point out things that, hadn't been confessed. So if you failed to notice that you had done something wrong, they would point it out at this time and also say, you should have noticed and you should have said sorry. So after this kind of morning meeting, we would go back to the Sodo and do a ceremony called Shitsunai Kankin, which I had never heard of before. And this is kind of like a ceremony to kind of re-establish a connection with your own teacher and lineage. And so you read a number of texts, including Dogen's Buddhas and ancestors. And then you also, when you do the morning service, you name all of the ancestors, but only up to a certain point when you kind of reach the first abbot of the temple. So you kind of go back to the point where your lineage breaks off from that one, and you have to recite your own lineage all the way up to Toto-san in my case. And so it was a nice time, at least, to remember my connection to Toto-san and Sanshin-ji, and that I wasn't going to be a Kotaiji forever. And also, it was kind of funny too, because this was only done by the training monks, so none of the higher up people were in the room with us. And so they would do this incredibly fast to try to get through it as quickly as possible so that they could, have like 2 minutes break. And so, I got pretty good at doing these chants really fast. So they'd go like, "Ware mukashi yori tsukureru moro moro no wakugo wa minamushi no tonjin shi ni yorite mitokuji," like this. So it's like that speed, and you have to kind of keep up with them. So after this, we would eat finally. So most of the time we would eat in the kuin, so that's the building opposite the Sodo, where the kitchen is, in sort of a more casual setting. We still would eat oryoki most of the time for breakfast, but sometimes we would eat in the Sodo, particularly during sesshin. And in the case of eating in the Sodo, there was a whole kind of complex addition with serving, but I won't go into the details of all of that. Every morning, though, we would have rice gruel without exception. The only kind of variation was that, there was a third dish, which would be something different each day. And then also you'd have gomashio, the sort of sesame and salt mixture some days. And then other days you'd have shiokombu, like salted seaweed, which you weren't allowed to put on the rice, but you were allowed to put the gomashio on. I don't know why. So lots of little rules like this. And then after the meal was finished, we would have another kind of meeting about the work that we would be doing that day, and then we'd have our first period of samu, which was usually like cleaning for the first period of the day. So one kind of funny thing was, this was the winter, and in the city of Nagasaki, but we still had people sweeping, or actually leaf blowing leaves every single day of the winter, even when there were no more leaves left. By the time it was like, February, there were no more leaves to be had, but still we had people going out, getting like trying to find the one leaf to sweep up. So it kind of didn't really matter. And it was the same with the cleaning. You'd clean the same stuff that you cleaned every day. So it was already clean by the time, you were getting to it that morning. So it was just kind of the ritual of cleaning almost. So after this was the tea that I talked about. So this is my favorite part of the day. At 8:30, we got together and had tea and coffee and kind of luxurious sweets and fruit. And then there was another work period. And we'd kind of continue with cleaning some days. Sometimes we'd have like special projects that we needed to work on. And also at this time, this was when we would start doing memorial services. So as I mentioned, this temple had I think it was like 2,500 danka families, which is like a huge number. And so pretty much every day, and especially on the weekends, we were doing memorial services from like, 9 to 5, basically. And then a lot of the Japanese priests would go out of the temple to do funerals and memorial services at people's homes. I only did the ones that were like in the temple and only as like a support person. So sometimes you were basically assigned to one of these. After this next period of work, there were some more instruments that you'd hear, and that was a signal that it was time for the noon ceremony. So we never do noon or evening ceremonies here, but in Japanese temples it's pretty common. So it's like a shorter service. At Kotaiji, they had another building called a Butsuden that had a really huge statue of what's the name of the Buddha? Dainichi Nyorai, so the sort of cosmic Buddha from the Flower Garland Sutra. And so we'd go there and do this dharani, sort of similar to the Daihijin dharani, but a different text. And this was, again, one that we would usually do just with training monks. Sometimes like one of the higher-ups would come to be the doshi, but not always. And they often took this as a they sort of treated it like practice a little bit for like learning how to do various ceremonial roles. So they'd put people into like, the position of doing kokyo, for example, like reading the echo here before you do it in the morning service. After this, we had lunch, and then the kind of only like real break of the day was after lunch. And so like we would eat lunch at 11:30, usually finish by noon. And then you'd have a break until 1:30 when the next period of samu started. And you'd basically continue to do work like you had before until the evening ceremony, which was at 4 o'clock. So it's kind of similar, except this one was in the regular Buddha hall. And there was sort of a rotating set of texts that we would do for that. And then finally you'd have dinner, and then bath time after dinner, which was always a nice part of the day as well. They had a big bath, and you got to have a nice relaxing hot bath at the end of every day. Interestingly, you had to say a verse and do prostrations on the 4 and 9 days, which were like the slightly more relaxed days, because apparently that you would only historically take a bath on those days. And so that was like the formal bath day. But then at some point they added bathing every day, and so all the other days were informal because I guess you're not technically like supposed to be taking a bath. And then depending on the day, we would sometimes have one period of zazen in the evening, sometimes two, sometimes none. Often it would get canceled because we had to rehearse for some complicated ceremony. And this was also the time that you would like, if you were assigned a new role, and often it was kind of cruel, they would just sort of, out of the blue be like, oh, tomorrow you're doing this role that you know nothing about. Please learn it in the next hour. And you'd have to, yourself find someone to teach you. They wouldn't like give you a tutorial or something. You'd have to like go beg someone, please like teach me what to do. I don't know what to do. And they thought that this was like good training to do it this way. And so after the final period of zazen, at around 8:50, they start hitting the bonsho, and after the bonsho is done, you're allowed to go to sleep. So like at 9. Most people wouldn't go to sleep because this was like, again, one of the only opportunities you had to sort of take a break. So people would sometimes stay up, half an hour, and go to bed at like 10. But of course, you had to wake up at 4. So it was always a little bit dangerous. So I would usually try to go to bed as soon as I could. But some of the Japanese would stay up really late and were just like super tired. There was one guy in particular who, every morning he was like, like this during the zazen, and he was always getting hit with the kyosaku by the abbot. And sometimes he would like smash into the wall and make like everyone would like jump. It was really bad. And it was funny too, because the abbot often would, because the Japanese in particular would often sleep during zazen in the morning. Because many of these are people from temple families, and they'll probably never do zazen again after they go home. They're just going to do funeral services. So for a lot of them, zazen isn't really important. Another way that it's kind of like the inversion of here. But the abbot would often scold the Japanese and say, you should do zazen like the foreigners. Like the foreigners know how to do zazen, you guys don't. He would be like, they're putting you to shame. So I thought that was funny. And yeah, so that's kind of the typical day. And some days, we would have, there was a rotating schedule of ceremonies during the month. Usually the first of the month and like the 15th of the month always had like a lot of complicated ceremonies. And then there were some that were annual. So, for example, we had Rohatsu Sesshin, but then there's like a big ceremony that happens after the Rohatsu Sesshin to celebrate the Buddha's enlightenment. It was the same with Nirvana Day. And I always kind of dreaded having to do those. So, anyway, that's the schedule. And I thought I'd just share a few little kind of anecdotes. So one kind of interesting thing, I mentioned sleeping in the sodo. So the sodo is this big it's basically one big room with these raised platforms, and that's where you're sleeping every night. So your kind of private space is a single piece of tatami, so from here to there. And you have a little cabinet where you can keep your things. And there's someone like literally 6 inches next to you sleeping right there. And the whole, building was full. And so, yeah, some people would snore pretty loudly. So the first few nights it was pretty difficult to get to sleep, but eventually you become so tired that it's not so hard to fall asleep, even though there's a lot of distractions. But then during the day, there's not much going on in the sodo, and everything sort of shifts to another section called the shuryo, which is like the study hall technically, but really it was kind of like just like the hangout room for the training monks, I'd say. So everyone had like a desk in there, and the higher ups usually would never come in. So it was kind of like our private space in a way. It still wasn't private at all because there's no, it's again just one big room. But it was kind of the space where people kind of let their hair down a little bit, and we were in there during the break and so forth. I mentioned kind of receiving jobs. Okay, so here's something about kind of blending in, I guess. Being different is not our practice, right? So one of the things that was really interesting is, you were constantly getting corrected on all kinds of things. So I can give you a little taste. They told us to write down, when you're corrected on something, you should write it down so you remember. So I have a list of some of the things that I was corrected on here. Let's see if I can find it real fast. Okay, so this is the corrections to the 10th of November, so just 10 days. Cover feet in seiza. 4 fingers length from ground to kimono, again to koromo, again to okesa. So this is like the correct length that your robes should be. Hold sutra book with 3 vertical fingers when seated, but keep arms out so sleeves do not fall. So not the way I'm doing it right now. So it should be like this. Somehow straight, but also with your arms out, which is very difficult. When standing, fingers at 45-degree angle. So like this. I liked this one. So takuan are these like pickled radish pieces that in the morning you use to sort of like wipe up your bowl, or actually for all the meals, you use to kind of wipe out your bowl. You pour tea or water into the bowl and then use the pickle to clean it. So I was corrected for eating the takuan too loudly. and I was chewing with my mouth closed. It wasn't like chewing with my mouth open. So I was like, what do I do? Like, how do I not make noise? And they were like, you need to move your teeth horizontally, like side to side rather than just up and down. So I wrote that. Eat takuan quietly by grinding it horizontally rather than vertically. Open kesa quietly when putting it on. Do not let it flop back. And at an angle so that it does not bump your neighbor. So someone's right here. So when you open up your okesa in the morning, it's very easy to whack them. So you have to sort of turn and do it this way. So do not wear towel on head and rakusu at the same time. So when you were doing samu, you would tie a towel onto your head. And you would just wear your samuai and do your morning work. So you could go out like that. You could be out in public spaces like that while you're doing samu. Or you could be wearing your rakusu with your samuai, but you couldn't wear both, and you couldn't wear samuai with nothing. So you had to either be wearing a towel or a rakusu, but not both. Let's see if there are any other good ones in here. Make less noise with oryoki. So that was always one, because all the utensils sort of clack together a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. That's enough for now. But what I was going to say, so these are an example of some of the corrections that I received. But the interesting thing was we were just supposed to say height. When you're being corrected, you just say height, yes. And the foreigners would almost always say something, I knew that, but I forgot, and they'd be like, shut up, just say height, and it was so hard for them to do that, almost. And there was this one woman from Sweden, oh my God, every time she would just try to start an argument about how she had actually done the thing right. And it just drove the Japanese absolutely crazy that she couldn't just say, yes, I understand. So I thought that was interesting because, our tendency is to sort of, protect ourselves. It's like we're being attacked, by being corrected. But really, that's not what they're doing. They're just trying to get everyone on the same page. And so it was a good practice, I thought, to just say, hi, yes, I understand. Because it's, and Dogen is always stressing letting go of self-clinging, of self-attachment. And this is kind of one way to do that. At least in this context, I think it's okay. Of course, there are contexts where you don't want to just say hi, but in this context where you're just being corrected on ceremonial stuff, I think it's fine to just do that. Another little anecdote. So, of course, Japanese Buddhism is very involved in the death industry. So I mentioned that we're doing all these funerals and memorial services. One thing that happened that was kind of strange, it was in my first 2 weeks, I was suddenly sort of pulled aside and told to go help this guy, Goshi-san, who was a Japanese practitioner. Interesting, he was not from a temple family. He was one of the few there who wasn't. And he was always kind of disgruntled. But at any rate, I was supposed to go help him with some task that I didn't know what it was. And so we go to this shelf outside, and it has all these kind of big clay pots, and they're full of ashes, and it quickly becomes apparent that these are human ashes, and with bone fragments and everything, and they're having us dump them all into this one or several big bags. So we're dumping from several urns into this one bag, and I have no idea what's going on or why we're doing this. And then we have to carry this up the mountain. So there's a cemetery behind the temple on the side of a mountain. It's absolutely huge, probably 100 acres of graves, because it's shared between multiple temples that line the street. And we get to this one big it's like a concrete box, basically, sort of like a vault. And we're told to clean it up, so we clean it up. And there's a stone on the top that covers this hole. We open up the hole, and it's full of other ashes. and then we just have to dump all these ashes into this big pit. And it kind of, I'm using my broken Japanese to try to figure out what exactly we're doing, and Goshi-san is explaining to me that these are the people that basically couldn't afford like a proper funeral, or didn't have relatives who would take care of their ashes. And so after doing this, it was like me and 2 other foreigners and Goshi-san, who again is not from a temple family, and none of us like knew like chanting very well. Like we could all do the Heart Sutra, I think, but that was it. So we did the Heart Sutra, and closed the thing back up and went back down. But it really reminded me of Uchiyama Roshi's writing in Zazen is True Religion, where he sort of criticizes the funeral industry and how some people can like pay for these very elaborate services and get these very fancy dharma names for their relatives, while others, get something that's very minimal, or in this case, completely minimal, where the sort of basically the lowest ranking monks are like dumping you into a pit and then like doing like a very sort of poor service on your behalf. So it felt a little bad, to be the one responsible for this task, not even knowing what I was doing, and just kind of the I mean, there was some regard, of course. It wasn't like they were just thrown in a ditch. They had a monument, and we did do a minimal service. But at the same time, seeing all the elaborate services that we would do to, the paying members of society, it felt a little bad to be the one tasked with this. So I'm running short on time. I guess I'll share one last thing. So like, something that I found very positive about the experience, and then I'll just wrap up quickly. So one of the things that I was really impressed with, and this is, I think, just a trait of Japanese culture in general, was the Japanese practitioners were really like almost telepathically able to like detect if something was wrong, or if you were too tired, or if you were really stressed. Like sometimes I felt like I was really putting on like a brave face, but then they'd like someone would be like, "Oh, it looks like you've been working too hard. Maybe you need to take an extra rest or something." And they have a term for this, like a couple terms in Japanese. So omoiyari, which is like sort of sometimes translated as empathy. It's literally kind of like giving thought to someone. And also kuki o yomu, which is like, we would say reading the room, but it literally means reading the air. So my kind of fellow Japanese practitioners were always really amazing with this, like I'd in sort of some of the worst moments, they'd like step in and like know what was going on and like do something to take care of me, So there was one day, I have this alpha gal, this red meat allergy. So they sometimes had to make, usually there wasn't red meat and things most of the time, but sometimes there was. And so they would have to make special meals for me. And during lunch, we would usually, it was kind of like a self-serve style because people were out doing ceremonies and so forth. So they made this special lunch for me, but then someone ate it. And so I didn't get lunch because the other thing had food that I couldn't eat in it. And I just sort of like mentioned this in passing to one of the monks who I hadn't really like talked with very much. And he happened to be the one going out to do the shopping that day. And like a couple hours later, he like brings me this bag just like full of like convenience store food, like all these like onigiri and like other snacks and stuff, I had like no expectation that he, would have done this just from my like passing remark. There was also the guy who like was the most senior of the training monks, was really kind of scary, like he would get angry sometimes, and you didn't want to be on the receiving end of his discipline. Like a really tough kind of looking guy. But even he too, like sometimes after like dishing out this like harsh criticism of people, he would like read on their faces that he had maybe like gone too far, and then like maybe a little later like go and kind of apologize in sort of maybe like an indirect way, maybe not so directly, but or like give them an extra break or do something nice to kind of make up for the fact that he had just been kind of cruel. And so this behavior I thought was interesting because it's a very difficult environment you're in. So to have this kind of ability of people to tune in to what's going on with you and to take care of you was really nice. And I feel like we're not very good at this. Like I feel personally like I'm not able to read people in that way. But after a few of these experiences, I tried to be better about it, and particularly with the other kind of foreign people, to tune in to when things were difficult and see if I could do something to be helpful. So in conclusion, what did I sort of learn from the experience? I'd say, repeatedly, I felt appreciation for our style of practice here at Sanshin. I often sort of wished I was back here in some ways. I found myself kind of, boasting sometimes about the way that we do things. And I think also like our, Todo-san and our tradition have a lot of respect from other lineages. So both the Japanese and the foreigners all kind of, for the most part, knew about our lineage and, had generally nice things to say about it. There was one guy who I guess from his teacher had heard some joke about Uchiyama Roshi, and he did this like imitation of his teeth. He went like, "Oh, Uchiyama Roshi." Like, it was, I mean, he had good things to say about him, but apparently he'd seen this like caricature of him somewhere, like making fun of his appearance, which was kind of silly. And they also knew that he was like an origami master, which was interesting because often people don't talk about that here so much. And along with this, another thing that you'd notice there was that things looked kind of unsustainable with the Soto Zen practice going on, because I mentioned all these Danka families, but like when we would have special ceremonies, the average age of the people attending was like 80. You wouldn't see anyone under 60 attending any of these things. And the Danka memberships are sort of rapidly dropping off because younger families are like, why should I, pay money for this? I can just, because they have like alternative funeral type services that you can get in Japan that are not religious, that are a lot more affordable. So people are generally going in that direction. And yet at the same time, it doesn't seem like there's much recognition of the value of Zazen potentially for people in modern life. So this is exactly what, Todo-san and Uchiyama Roshi and Sowaki Roshi tried to do, was, teach Zazen to regular people and say, look, this has value for your everyday life. But at Kotaiji, you didn't see any evidence that people were thinking that way. We did have a Zazen Kai like once a week, but people were given like basically no instruction. They were just like invited in to share the space, but they weren't really like encouraged or really taught about the significance of what they were doing or anything. So it seems like kind of a missed opportunity, that like they're not doing more in Japan to share Zazen, I think, as kind of like a, because in the past, Japanese Buddhism has been useful to people as kind of like ancestor care, basically. But as that fades, they need to adapt, and they already have this wonderful practice that we all appreciate here, but they're not really doing much with it there, it didn't seem to me. As I mentioned, this practice of omoiyari, so like kind of cluing in on other people's difficulties and trying to be helpful was pretty moving to me. And I'd like to try to apply that more, not just in my practice, but in my life. And then my sort of final takeaway was, even though I didn't like it so much, I often felt like, I wanted to leave. I was counting the days. By the last like 2 weeks, I was like literally counting the hours, like from like several thousand like down to 0. I still think it was an important experience. And I think it's important for Soto Zen priests outside of Japan because it's sort of one, like, it just clues us into what our tradition can be about in a different like flavor. It also gives us a better context for understanding what Sowaki Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi and Todo-san have done to adapt the tradition to make it what it is like we practice here. It also kind of, I think, just provides like sort of a minimum level of like credentialing, for priests here. Because it can be, I think, pretty easy to get away with not doing very much, as a priest in our tradition sometimes. So I feel like it was good to go there and have this kind of test of sorts. And yeah, and like I said at the beginning, I think it, was a form of professional development in a way. It helps you to understand what it means to be a priest, at least in one particular context. So I think with that, I will wrap up, and sorry for going on so long. It took a long time to go through the whole schedule. So well, thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Anybody has a questions or comments in this room?
Yeah, I was wondering, you touched on it briefly, but how did they deal with the situation of illness?
Yeah. So I got the flu after 2 weeks being there. So it was funny because we went to get flu shots, and like the next day I had a fever. And we like assumed it was probably like a reaction to the flu shot or something. And so they were like, oh, just, keep practicing. And this was like the 15th, so this was the day the Ango opened, and we had all these like complicated ceremonies. And so I woke up, feeling like horrible. I had a fever, and I had to go through this like complicated ceremony. This is the one where we're asking the abbot questions, the mondo and all this. And after the ceremony, I was just like, I think I need to go to the doctor. Fortunately, they have very good medical care there. So with the visa that we had, you're covered by their medical system. So it was really kind of, this is like nothing to do with Buddhism, but it was very impressive. We went to this clinic. They immediately saw me. They looked in my throat and saw that it was inflamed. They did one of those like nasal swab things. And within like literally 2 minutes, they were like, you don't have COVID, but you have the flu. They had somehow managed to run this thing. Because here it takes like a day or like hours or whatever. And so I was in and out in like 5 minutes. But basically what they did was they put me in a room by myself for, I think it was like 5 days. It was like the recommended quarantine period, and they brought me my meals. And I was like keeping kind of a journal, and I wrote about kind of how I was happy to get sick. I got to have like a 5-day break, and I got to sleep as much as I wanted. And so it was kind of, in a way, I think, fortunate to have that period to step back. Yeah, that's what they did, was they basically quarantined people, but took care of them while they were in isolation.
Anybody else in this room?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead. No, clergy.
Can you repeat the first thing you said, the first catechism? It's the basis of my question.
Oh, the sort of mottos that I started with?
Yes.
So there's dignified conduct is the Buddha Dharma, and ritual etiquette is our sect's teaching.
Yeah, the dignified conduct is the Buddha Dharma.
Mm-hmm.
How does that square with your understanding of the Buddha Dharma?
I think that I don't think it's wrong. I wouldn't say that it's wrong-headed exactly, because I think that the way that we carry ourselves is kind of, in some sense, a reflection of our mental state and how much we're paying attention to what we're doing. And if we're completely absent-minded, we're not going to have good comportment. Whereas if you're paying attention, you may or may not, depending on your choices, I guess. And so that I think is maybe where I think it can feel a little wrong-headed sometimes is because, of course, in this context, there's only one right way to do everything, and you have to do it that way or else you're not practicing well. But of course, I think there's more than one way to have dignified conduct. But that being said, I think for the purposes of training, it's not necessarily bad to have one standard that kind of keeps it simpler. But for me, it feels a little rigid sometimes, and I think I'd be more comfortable saying that Shikantasa is the Buddha Dharma than dignified conduct. I mean, not that it's not. I mean, it's true, and I think that they're connected, of course. I think that we can take our Zazen mind and kind of use that as a basis for behaving in a dignified way off of the cushion. And I think that we should do that. But I think it's also can become problematic when you're like sort of yelling at someone in an uncompassionate way for not doing it right, because then that behavior is itself not very dignified, I would say. So I don't know, those are some of my thoughts on it, I guess.
So I think it's not, because you often, will bring up the example of washing the dishes simply to wash the dishes. I think that's not unconnected with what you're talking about, right? You're doing that form in order to do that form. The outcome of that form, is your hand here or here? The world won't end. It's the process of doing the form, right? Just like it's the process of washing the dishes. So I think those things are not unconnected. I just want to throw out one up. Before I left, and I said, Toto-san, do you have any last words for me? He said, do what you're told. Follow the schedule, do what you're told.
Yep.
Not unrelated.
Yeah, and I think it's good advice. I mean, the biggest sort of problems that you saw when people were just sort of like willfully ignoring.
Oh, ego.
Yeah.
Biggest problem. So I'm glad you had the experience of going, and I think you're planning to do the remaining 3 months, and so you'll do it again. But for Westerners, as you say, I think it's particularly helpful because we are not the majority in the room. We often don't know what's going on. We often are not fluent in the language. We can't read the room, and I can't tell you how many times things went over my head because I couldn't read the room, right? Not even individual, just stuff is happening, right? It's incredibly helpful for us in putting the ego over here and just saying hi, and just doing, and not poking our heads in. I'm sure you had the same experience that I did when we got there. We go, where are the handouts? Where are the checklists? And that's not the way we learn in that circumstance. And then people come along and think, well, no, so write down all that and I'll make a handout. And it's not that we can't make handouts, that's not how we learn. And for us, that's a real shift, right? So it sounds like you had some very useful, not always easy experiences. And I hope you'll continue to share that. So I'm sure everybody knows. I've asked Doju when he sees us kind of falling down on the form or we've missed an opportunity to speak up. So if he's doing that, it's not his ego. I'm asking him to help us. So I mean, there are probably things you didn't get to say today that I hope we'll hear going forward. Because to make a commitment and do that kind of training is not a small thing. And not everybody has the opportunity or the wherewithal to do it. And when people like Doju go to have that experience, get it in the body and bring it back, we need to have a lot of gratitude for that.
Thank you. Yeah, they were, the Doryu-san, the sort of most senior of the training monks, was fond of saying, this isn't primary school, this is university. You don't tell you how to do everything, you have to figure it out yourself.
Well, and so when you were mentioning about, they just say, tomorrow you're in this role, figure it out. There aren't checklists, there aren't handouts. You need to look around and figure it out. And there is something really useful about that, as difficult as that is, right? There's no hand holding, there's no on-ramp. And yet that's not uncompassionate.
Right.
You will really learn it.
Yeah.
You'll fall down and get up and you'll really learn it.
And people were, generally happy to teach you the role as long
Everyone's
as you
been in the
asked.
same boat.
And sort of showed gratitude,
Yes.
So
Next time, you'll be the one teaching them.
yeah. Clark, did you have something?
So I'm curious, anytime I've gone outside of routine for any length, I feel changed.
Yeah.
How do you, are you changed and how if you are?
I think I must be. I mean, I'd say while I was there, and I'm not sure if it was just adapting to the circumstance and if I've changed back now, but and I think maybe Eisho-san and Todo-san would find this funny, but the Japanese, you know, and it's probably partially because I could speak a little bit of Japanese, but they would say I was Nihonjin-poi, like I was sort of like a Japanese more than the other foreigners, because I didn't give them as much trouble. But I think that, you know, that took a lot of effort on my part to try to like fill that role. It wasn't like natural for me. And I think here, you know, I don't really behave in that same way. But I'm sure to some extent it's maybe rubbed off, hopefully, because I think that there are good aspects to that way of interacting where you're kind of concerned more with the group than just with yourself. So maybe, if so, you know, I think it would be hopefully something like that. Like hopefully I've gotten better at picking up on other people's needs and you know, what Shoken at Ryumonji, what he used to say was you should have the mind of service whenever you're practicing or in life. So hopefully I've improved my mind of service. Thanks.
Anybody else in the room? And then we can go to Zoom. Sawyer can check. Anybody?
I got a question from Abby.
Abby.
Yes, thank you, first of all. A very informative and frank explanation of your experience. Very helpful to me personally.
Okay.
I did also want to ask you, you mentioned there was a Swedish woman in the group, and I'm curious to know where she slept, how she ate, how much she was integrated in a group of person.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Most training monasteries in Japan are only for men. There is one training monastery that's only for women, where you know, one of my Dharma sisters, for example, practiced. But there are a few, like Toshoji, where Hoko practiced, and Kotaiji also, that are co-ed to some extent. But it's a little bit ad hoc at Kotaiji because they don't have separate living quarters really for women. So what they did is, so as I mentioned, all the men would sleep in the sodo, and there was a room in the Buddha hall, so where the main image was and where we do all the ceremonies. And they would use that for nuns when they came. So when she was there, she stayed in that room, and then she was only there for about a month and a half, and then she left. And there was a teacher training program that started for like more advanced Japanese priests, like sort of wanting to go further with their training as teachers. And there were 2 more nuns who came, and they stayed in that same room. And then also there was so there were 3 rooms with baths, and while they were there, one of those was devoted to the nuns. And other than that, I mean, they pretty much were completely integrated. I think that there was some, like, you know, like I said, Saito Roshi, the abbot, is very, very like concerned with like by the book protocol, and so I think he insisted on the nuns at least being in a separate building, because I think that that's like the way that whatever text says you have to do it. But yeah, other than that, there wasn't really much of a noticeable separation there. I'm curious about what was it like at Toshoji?
Yeah, it was the same for us, although, so there were 2 little rooms where the women would sleep, and there was one room, and that it got, so there were too many of us. So a couple of us were told we could clean out the storage room over the kitchen, and then we could use that. So I was very happy to do that because it was much space. So 2 of us lived up there, and I think 2 or 3 more lived downstairs. But when it came to the bath, we would alternate. The women would go first one day, and then the men, and then we'd do it the other way. But in terms of the job rotation and the service positions, there was no difference.
Yeah.
We were all doing everything. There was no men are ringing the bells, women are making the tea going on. It was, because we were all there to train. But the abbot of that temple felt was used to Westerners and felt it was important that everybody trained and that Western people learned what they could learn to take it back. Right? So I didn't feel any unevenness about that. You will run into somebody from time to time, some guy who's not comfortable with women. He's just not comfortable with women, let alone Western and in robes. But that tended to be an individual thing, and it was by no means the majority. We all got along pretty well. So yeah, I mean, you make provision because you have to make some provision for modesty and comfort and practice. But when it came to doing the practice, we were all completely together.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question, thank you.
Anybody else in the world?
So we're going to come after you at tea time with our individual.
That's fine.